Now, what did you call yourself?
We became known as the Buffalo Nine. It seems in those days that there was the Chicago Eight.
Yes.
But we made up a baseball team. We were the Buffalo Nine. And we began to recognize very quickly that we were involved in something more than just a couple of draft resistors sitting in a church. We claimed at the time that the U.S. police forces had actively set out to cause a violent situation in that church to discredit Bruce's and my position regarding our nonviolent resistance to the war. Because the issue became not are you opposed to the war, but did you or did you not assault this cop?
Yes.
And there was a subsequent trial. I was convicted on 2 of the 3 counts.
Now, was this a bench trial or jury trial?
Excuse me. This was a jury trial.
What was the jury like?
Well, it was composed of regular citizens. Our attorneys at the time were from the Emergency Civil Liberties Committee in New York. Jerry Lefcourt and Michael Kennedy were 2 outstanding progressive attorneys who represented us pro bono. God knows how. The trial must have cost somebody tons of money, and we didn't have anything, obviously.
How long did the trial last?
It went on for 6 days.
6 days. Were you able to put the war on trial?
We definitely were able to put the war on trial, although Judge Curtin at the time wasn't totally responsive to our arguments. He at least allowed them to go forward. We were each of us testified in our own behalf, and we were able, through our testimony and through the competency of the attorneys we had at the time, to bring politics into the courtroom, to bring the war to the courtroom, which is what we were trying to do, and to put the war before the jury and to make the jury decide. Well, of course, the U.S. attorney at the time was a fellow named Edgar Nemoyer, who argued that the war isn't the issue here. The issue is whether or not you punched this cop in the face, or you bit this cop, or you did this. And he kept trying to focus the testimony and the proceedings along those lines. And the judge allowed us, Curtin allowed us to at least raise the issue of the war.
And how did the jury respond?
In the first trial, the jury was hung on 2 of my co-defendants, found me guilty.
No,
and go ahead.
But after you were found guilty, then what happened?
Immediately following the conviction, hundreds of students gathered in Niagara Square. I hesitate to say thousands, but I think it was actually, because the square was completely ringed with people, and there was crowds going up Court Street in front of the federal courthouse, the old federal courthouse. There was a strike at the University of Buffalo, and students took over the administration building. It was Hayes Hall at that time on the south
And
campus.
that's the building with the clock.
Yes.
So they were the original occupiers.
Yes. The building was seized and held for, 24 hours, something like that.
That was what, March of 1969?
Correct.
Didn't the university president actually talk to the students?
Yeah, Martin Morrison was an interesting guy who was brought to Buffalo from the California university system to oversee the running of the University of Buffalo, which was at that time an extremely progressive institution. The English department was legendary, and what was going on at the university at that time was legendary. And that's part of the dichotomy between working class Buffalo and the university, which sat on the edge of town and had never really involved itself in the affairs of the city. And so it was easy for common council people to see the university as separate apart from. And
Well, Buffalo at the time was known as the Berkeley of the East, is that
the
correct?
University of Buffalo was, yeah.
Yes.
I wouldn't say the city
Yes.
was.
But the university was. So what happened with the students? It's my understanding Judge Stiller, Norman Stiller, issued an order directing the students to vacate Hayes Hall.
And then the university was under siege by the Buffalo Police Department, and students vacated the building, and then began at the university a year of pretty intense unrest among the students.
Now, after the occupation at Hayes Hall, what did you personally do?
Well, I had been released. Judge Curtin released me on bail, and in my mind, and the attorneys had decided they were going to appeal the conviction, so I was released on bail pending the appeal. In my mind, I began to prepare to go to jail. And it was my intention at that point to go to jail. I've been convicted of 2 counts of assaulting federal marshals. I was sentenced to 2 3-year consecutive sentences. And then I was convicted, convicted of refusing induction into the military. So I knew I was facing some time. Good behavior. Excuse me. Good behavior, I'd probably be out in 18 months, 2 years on a 3-year sentence. But I hadn't been sentenced on the draft charges. I didn't know what he was going to do there. He'd been handing out some intense sentences.
And this is Judge Curtin.
Yeah. To draft resistors.
And that was designed to get everybody to fall into line and report.
Well, the selective service system was headed up by a guy named Louis B. Hershey, who was a former general, Second World War. He wrote an amazing document called the Channeling Statement, which justified the use of selective service. He said the psychology of granting wide choice under pressure to take action is the American or indirect way of achieving what is done in foreign countries where choice is not permitted. And what that document laid out, what he says in that statement is, as long as you do certain things, we're going to allow that to go ahead. So if you want to be a teacher, if you want to work in the civilian military or industrial complex, in other words, making airplanes or whatever, guns, we'll give you a deferment for those things. If you want to be a student, we'll give you or a teacher or whatever. But within the context of you are going to do what you're told. The psychology of granting wide choice under pressure. We're going to control your decision-making process. Obviously, you've got a lot of choices, but you've got to do one of them. If you step outside that, we're going to prosecute you. So the club of induction he talks about is what, when you refuse that and you refuse to participate, the only other thing they could do was charge you with a crime and throw you in jail. And that's what they tried to do.
Yes. So you were prepared to go to jail, but you decided to take a different course.
Well,
ultimately,
I became involved very much in I started to understand American foreign policy outside of the context of Vietnam. That the war in Korea was more than what very little I'd learned about it. That it was, in those days, it was about trying to contain an oppositional government, whether one agreed with it or not, communism in China or Soviet Union or wherever. And believe me, I wasn't a communist. Not that I had anything against him, it just it didn't appeal to me. I was much more youth oriented, much more. My politics were anti-war, and I began to understand what was going on in Latin America and Africa as being part of an economic foreign policy that was imperialist, and that it was about markets, and it was about expanding American control in markets. And I began to use the word imperialism where I never had before. I always talked in moral terms. So I got involved in the student movement with SDS at the university, and throughout late 1969, early 1970, there were major student uprisings at the university, and I was indicted for inciting a riot, in that I gave a speech after which students went out and destroyed an ROTC office, a Reserve Officers Training Corps office. I was indicted for inciting a riot, burglary, arson, conspiracy to commit, a whole nonsense load of charges.
Oh, who brought these charges?
The county.
Oh, the county, okay.
There were 19 of us arrested with those charges, varying degrees of them. We became known as the ROTC 19. And when added end to end, I was now facing about 30 years in jail if I'd been convicted. And so my thoughts about going to prison started to change. I wasn't so sure that's where I wanted to be. I didn't feel that I had anything to do with students destroying the ROTC building other than giving a speech. Of course, the speech was anti-ROTC, but it didn't say, go out and get
Yes.
this building and burn it down. It was just anti-ROTC. So in March of 1970, facing that many number of years in jail, and a friend of mine, an attorney named Bill Myers, who worked for Richard Lipsitz, called me and said, things are going to get hot now, Bruce, and maybe you ought to think things through a little differently.
Yes.
And the next morning I left the United States, went underground to Montreal, spent 6 months in Canada trying to get a false passport because I didn't have any travel documents. And finally did get a false Canadian passport, got on a plane in Toronto and flew to Stockholm, Sweden, where I was granted humanitarian asylum by the Swedish government. The Swedish government obviously opposed what was going on in Vietnam. And I spent the next 2 years living in Sweden. I worked for the World Council of Churches, doing a refugee, working for a refugee assistance group. We called ourselves the Center. We were made up mostly of American draft sisters and deserters who were living in Stockholm at the time. And during that time, I married a Canadian woman. And because I was married to her, I was able to immigrate to Canada, which I did in 1972. And I lived for the next 5 years from 72 to 77 in Canada, and worked with a group of American war resistors living there, mostly deserters and draft resistors, obviously. We published a magazine called Amex Canada. I was tangentially involved with Amex in that I certainly attended meetings and wrote some articles, and it was mostly headed up by my friend Jack Calhoun. The magazine was very, very interesting and very well written, and it was through that work that I became involved in the amnesty movement.
Yes.
And in 1975, I was given a book by a friend of mine, by a woman named Gloria Emerson. Gloria was the only female correspondent to cover the Vietnam War for the New York Times. And she wrote, obviously it's after the war, she wrote a book called Winners and Losers. And I read this book and came to the realization that in order for me to bring my story to a logical conclusion, I needed to come back to the States.
Yes.
And it was for my own personal sense of bringing this thing, getting it over with. Because otherwise, I loved Canada, and I was treated extremely well in both Canada and Sweden. The government went out of its way to make us, all of us, war resistors, as comfortable as we could under the situation, And there was this. I can't allow this country to forget what had happened in Vietnam, because already by 1975, Nixon was urging the people, Nixon and John and the guy who followed him, Ford, were urging Americans, put the war behind you. We need to move forward. Don't look back. Don't understand the history of what you've just been through. And I felt that by coming back to the States, and that I would, at least for my own sense of self, that I'd be forcing some mirror up in front of the American people that said, look at yourselves, don't forget this war. If you forget this war, you make it possible for them to do more of this crap. So on October 20th, 1977, 10 years from the day that I turned my draft card into the Justice Department, I decided I would come back to the States, walk across the Peace Bridge, to highlight my opposition to future wars. The river here obviously demarks the difference between the United States and Canada. So it's an international border, and it's only less than a mile wide. And along this river, United Empire loyalists who opposed the Revolutionary War left the United States and went to Canada at the time of the Revolutionary War. And it was a huge migration of Americans who left the country. I think that 1 out of every 4 Canadians can trace their ancestry to that particular time in history. So then history goes on, and the border became important as a demarcation point between freedom and slavery, or slavery and freedom, as the case may be. And thousands of African Americans left this country and went to Canada because they weren't slaves there. So then the Vietnam War comes along in the 1960s, and because of the efforts of the Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Trudeau, the border becomes important again because Canada allowed refuge to American war resistors, deserters, and draft resistors. So in 1977, when I decided to come back to the States, it made most sense to walk across this bridge, the Peace Bridge, that represented peace between 2 nations, and come back here and surrender. So we did. And this is where I came across.
And that was in 1977?
October 20th, 1977.
Okay. Thank you, Bruce Beyer. There you have it.
And interestingly enough, I was joined in that process by a lot of people, but Gloria Emerson was one of them. She walked with me across the bridge. But the 2 of the most prominent people were a guy named Ramsey Clark, who was the former United States Attorney General and who had agreed to represent me when I came back to the States, act as my attorney, and a guy named Edson Miller, who was the highest ranking Marine Corps POW held in a prison camp in North Vietnam for 5 years, who when he bailed out of his plane after he was shot down broke his back and was carried from the DMZ, the demarcation line between the North and the South, all the way up the Ho Chi Minh Trail to Hanoi on a stretcher by the Vietnamese, his enemies. And when he was released from the POW camps and went through his medical discharge process, was told by naval surgeons that if he'd been rescued by the Americans at that time, he probably wouldn't be able to walk today because they would have done some unnecessary surgery in a combat situation. And he was, as we're walking across the bridge, he's telling me this story about being held in a POW camp. It was, and there's the U.S. Attorney General on one hand and Edson Miller on the other. It was like, holy, it was amazing. And there were 40 Vietnam vets who crossed the bridge with me. we were obviously trying to make a statement that there is no split between Vietnam vet. I'm sure there's a lot of veterans out there who don't agree with what I did, or but there's also a lot of veterans who did support me.
Yes.
And it was quite a day.
So
I
what,
was arrested as soon as I got across the border.
and this happened at the Peace Bridge?
Yes, arrested by U.S. Marshals and taken downtown and put in jail. And I literally expected to be in a car in a couple hours on my way to Lewisburg Prison. But the federal government and its desire to spirit me away hadn't taken into consideration that the federal district court, in the face of Judge Curtin, the man who had sentenced me, had changed his position on the war and had become really outspoken and told the press, "I don't like this." And when they brought me into court, he said, "I'm going to have to think about whether you should go to jail, Mr. Beyer." And he released me on bail, on my own recognizances, no money requested. And it was really quite amazing. I never expected to walk out of the courtroom that day, and yet there I was walking out. It was amazing.
Stay tuned for part 4.